The man who would one day redraw the map of the world, who would force popes to their knees and emperors to abdicate, stood on a ridge overlooking the Italian coast. He was shivering. On that cold morning in March 1796, Napoleon Bonaparte did not look like a conqueror. He looked like a victim. He was shivering. On that cold morning in March 1796, Napoleon Bonaparte did not look like a conqueror. He looked like a victim. He was 26 years old, his skin sallow and yellowed by parasites, his frame so skeletal that his uniform hung off him like a sack. But the most shocking detail wasn't his youth or his illness. It was his feet. The future emperor of the French possessed a pair of boots so worn through that the soles were held together with twine. History books love to write about the glory of the French Empire. They speak of the gold eagles and the heavy cavalry charges, but they conveniently skip the smell of the army of Italy in 1796. They skip the fact that the 37,000 men under Napoleon's command were not an army, they were a traveling riot. They had no pay, no food, no horses, and no hope. They were eating rats to survive. This is not the story of a victory lap. This is the story of a gamble so reckless, so mathematically improbable, that by all laws of logic, it should have ended in a firing squad, not a coronation. The atmosphere in the headquarters at Nice was toxic. The air was thick with the smoke of cheap tobacco and the stench of insubordination. Waiting for the new commander were the veterans, General André Massena and General Pierre Augereau. These were giants of men, hardened street fighters who had risen from the gutter to the rank of general through blood and gunpowder. They looked at the paperwork announcing their new superior, Bonaparte, a political appointee, a Corsican ogre, a mathematician who had learned war from books, not bayonets. When Napoleon finally walked into the room, Augereau actually laughed. He saw a dwarf, a little man with uncombed hair, and a wife famously unfaithful to him back in Paris. The tension in the room was a physical weight. Augereau leaned forward, ready to bully the boy. Napoleon didn't blink. He didn't shout. He simply adjusted his bicorn hat, looked up into the towering eyes of Augereau, and spoke with a voice devoid of emotion, cold, precise, hypnotic. "General," Napoleon whispered, the silence in the room deafening, "you are a head taller than me, but if you continue to be insolent, I will immediately eliminate that difference." It was a bluff. It was the first of 1,000 bluffs. But in that moment, the math nerd vanished. A predator had entered the room. The generals fell silent. They didn't respect him yet, but for the first time they feared him. Securing the generals was one thing. The army was another. The soldiers were on the verge of mutiny. Why should they march for a republic that couldn't even feed them? Napoleon understood something that the politicians in Paris did not. You don't motivate starving men with liberty, equality, fraternity. You motivate them with greed. You motivate them with pride. Securing the generals was one thing. The army was another. The soldiers were on the verge of mutiny. Why should they march for a republic that couldn't even feed them? Napoleon understood something that the politicians in Paris did not. You don't motivate starving men with liberty, equality, fraternity. You motivate them with greed. You motivate them with pride. He gathered the skeleton battalions. He looked at their rags. He didn't offer sympathy. He offered them a transaction. "Soldiers," his voice cut through the wind. You are naked, ill-fed. The government owes you much. It can give you nothing." He paused, letting the reality sink in. Then he pointed south toward the jagged peaks of the Alps, and beyond them the hazy plains of Italy. "I will lead you into the most fertile plains on earth. Rich provinces, opulent towns, all shall be at your disposal. Soldiers of Italy, will you lack courage or endurance?" He didn't promise them virtue. He promised them loot. He transformed their starvation into a weapon. In 20 minutes he turned a mob of beggars into a pack of wolves. The strategy was suicide. The Austrian Empire and their Piedmontese allies had over 50,000 well-fed, well-equipped troops waiting in the passes. They held the high ground. They had the cannons. Napoleon had speed. He introduced a concept the world wasn't ready for: force multiplier through velocity. They marched, and they marched, and they marched, and they marched. He demanded a pace that seasoned officers called insanity. Men collapsed, their lungs burning, their bare feet leaving bloody footprints on the alpine rocks. But Napoleon was everywhere. He was walking beside the caissons, pushing wheels, calculating logistics in his head, sleeping 2 hours a night. The Austrians were fighting a gentleman's war. They moved slowly, set up camp, and drank tea. Napoleon was fighting a street brawl. Montagnat, April 12th, the first contact. The French struck before the Austrians even finished breakfast. Boom. Napoleon concentrated his forces on a single weak point. Boom. He split the enemy's center. Boom. The Austrian general d'Argenteau was routed before he could understand what was happening. It wasn't a battle. It was a physics equation solved with violence. Millesimo, April 13th, the very next day. No rest, no celebration. Activity, activity, speed. Napoleon screamed at his exhausted aides. He caught the Piedmontese army isolated. He crushed them. In 2 weeks, the Scarecrow Army had won 6 battles, captured 21 flags, and seized 55 cannons. The soldiers finally had shoes. They had bread. They had wine. But more importantly, they had a god. They stopped calling him the general. They started calling him the little corporal. He was one of them. By May, the Austrians were reeling, retreating across the Po River to make a stand at Lodi. This was the trap. To get to Milan, the jewel of Italy, Napoleon had to cross a narrow wooden bridge, 200 yards long. On the other side, the Austrian rear guard had positioned dozens of cannons aimed directly down the throat of the bridge. It was a kill zone. Any man who stepped on that wood would be turned into pink mist. The French grenadiers hesitated. Who wouldn't? It was certain death. The momentum of the entire campaign stalled. The generals looked at Napoleon. This is it, they thought. The luck runs out here. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and fear. The Austrian cannons roared, and the first planks of the bridge splintered into toothpicks. Napoleon didn't issue an order from the rear. He didn't look at a map. He rode forward. He realized that courage is contagious. He knew that if they stopped now, the psychological spell would break. Grenadiers, forward. Messina and Lannes, the skeptics from Nice, saw the young commander in the line of fire. Shamed by his courage, they drew their sabers. They sprinted onto the bridge. The air turned solid with lead. Grape-shot bags of metal balls fired from cannons shredded the front ranks. Men fell in heaps. The column wavered. It stopped. This was the moment. The history of Europe hung on a delay of seconds. Napoleon's will clamped down on the chaos. The French artillery, positioned by the math nerd himself, returned fire with surgical precision, blinding the Austrian gunners with smoke. "Follow me," the French surged. They climbed over the bodies of their comrades. They bayoneted the Austrian gunners at their posts. The bridge was taken. It wasn't just a tactical victory. It was a psychological transcendence. Napoleon later wrote, "It was only on the evening of Lodi that I believed myself a superior man, and that the ambition came to me of executing the great things which so far had been occupying my mind only as a fantastic dream." At Lodi the general died. The emperor was born. May 15th, 1796. The army of Italy entered Milan. They were no longer the ragged beggars of Nice. They wore new uniforms, stolen from Austrian depots. They rode fine horses. They marched with the swagger of immortals. The crowds cheered. Flowers rained down. The Italian people saw them as liberators, a sentiment that would change, but for now the adulation was intoxicating. Napoleon rode at the front. He was still thin, his hair still long and unkempt, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. He didn't smile. He sat in the ducal palace that night, the noise of the celebration outside muffled by the velvet curtains. He looked at the map. He had done the impossible. He had humiliated the Austrian Empire with a gang of shoeless castaways. But as he looked at the map, his eyes drifted away from Italy. He looked east, toward the Ottoman Empire, toward Egypt, toward India. "Europe is a molehill," he whispered to his aide Marmont. "All great empires and revolutions have been in the East." The soldiers were full. Their pockets were lined with gold. They thought the war was over. But for Napoleon Bonaparte, the hunger had only just begun. The world was vast, and he was just getting started.